LD Comics is a women-led welcoming to all forum run by creators. We champion the graphic novel form, particularly works with an autobiographical voice. Our activity is towards supporting and equipping graphic novelists, especially but not exclusively people identifying as women. Established in 2009 by Sarah Lightman and Nicola Streeten as Ladies Do Comics, today LD Comics is run by a committee of 6 published graphic novelists: Charlotte Bailey, Rachel Ball, Emma Burley, Lou Crosby, Wallace Eates and Nicola Streeten. From the start, the core of LDC's activity has been the monthly meetings, hosting presentations from invited guests to a public audience in a welcoming atmosphere for networking and making friends. The introduction of LDC online monthlies aims to replicate the joy and stimulation of our physical meetups. Everyone is welcome.
So in my first slide, I think I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit. I usually go by educator, illustrator, and animator. So educator because I'm a lecturer of English language at a university here in Sri Lanka. And I've been illustrating children's books and I'll be talking about all this and how it's come together over the last few years. I've recently, my research has also been related to comic studies, so I'd like to share a little bit from that as well. Yeah, so so as I mentioned, I have multiple titles that go under my name, and that sort of that sort of made me kind of a confused person for most of my life. I didn't know how to define myself when someone asked. It was mostly easy to just say I teach English, because people didn't really understand when I said I was an artist, especially in Sri Lanka. They'll have a million questions as to what an artist is, and just it's just been a constant debate with myself. And also when I had to choose what I had to study after school, that's been another challenge for me, to decide that I wanted to study art or study English, because both of these had been or still are really a passion of mine. But what I've come to realize is over the years that both of them are so important to me, and they've made me who I am in a sense. My academics and my research, I think, has made me sort of a more curious and more patient artist. And I think the artist in me has made me a better researcher in a way, and they've just gone hand in hand over the years. So I'm from Sri Lanka. I live in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Sri Lanka is a little island below India. So we're an island in the northern Indian Ocean. And on the right side is a map of Sri Lanka that we made for one of my animations. It's made out of, it's just painted on a canvas with little blobs of plasticine clay and Lego. And I think I might show you the animation right at the end of my talk. So Sri Lanka is a tiny country with this really long and complex history, and we've just come out of a 30-year-long civil war. And what I realized was, I think in uni and afterwards, that most of the history of Sri Lanka wasn't really taught in schools, and I had learned it through through depictions of artists in Sri Lanka. And I sort of wanted to do this myself and try and sort of incorporate history into my work. And I think I'll talk a little bit about that in detail as we go along. So this share with my husband. And we have a little workstation in a corner here. And I remember designing the space, he made sure there was this little panel between our two workspaces so that my mess wouldn't spill over to his side. he's quite a neat freak and I'm the opposite. So yeah, this is a little apartment, but we animate downstairs where there's a lot more space, but this is where I do most of my reading and thinking and sketching, I suppose. So as an artist slash educator, I think what I mainly do is to tell stories. And I think I've found it easier to define myself as a storyteller. So let me just go on to the next slide. Yeah, so these are some very early sort of doodles of when I first started teaching. So as a junior lecturer, we were forced to wear sari to work every day, which I hated. And most of the time I forgot to take an umbrella and I just be soaked. I don't know, the bottom part of it would always just get soaked in mud. So some of these sketches are some of my other lecturer friends coming to rescue me from a building that's far away with an umbrella. And so the one right at the bottom is where I'm heading off to work. I'm saying bye to my parents and to my two cats and my dog. And so I'm saying bye Amma, bye Tata, bye Toby, bye kittens. And then my parents stop me and say, so I need to run back home. So that's what's happening there. And on the right panel, it's a bus ride. So I used to take the bus to work, and it's in Sinhala I've written. There was this man who was seated next to me one time, and I remember him because he was wearing a pink shirt and matching pink shoes. And in the speech bubble right on top, it says, Mrs. This Boralla, which is a town, which is an area in Colombo. And he asks in Sinhala, and I reply in Sinhala saying, no, you have to go a little further to reach Boralla. And then a few minutes later, he asks, so are you Sri Lankan? and I was just speechless because I had just responded in Sinhala, but that happens to me quite often in Sri Lanka because I have fairer skin, I suppose, compared to most Sri Lankans. So I've just had special, I don't know, not special, but different treatment constantly, I think from school teachers and from, like, if we visited hotels with my family, we would always, there was always special treatment, I suppose, if you were foreign or if you were white. So that was just a weird kind of way to grow up in Sri Lanka, treated as a foreigner. But yeah, these are some snippets from early on when I first started teaching. And I also wanted to share a little bit about my ongoing research that I'm doing for my master's. So I've taken very popular and well-known books, but mainly because I wanted to look at how comics are so important when you're talking about memory and trauma. So I selected 5 books from my study and 5 autobiographical graphic novels, and they were all based on trauma and told through comics. So I looked at particularly memory and post-memory. And post-memory was something really interesting for me, especially coming from a country that's just been through a war, because post-memory essentially means memories that you have inherited, but they're not necessarily from your own experiences. So for instance, Mouse, which is the first picture here, is about the son of a Holocaust survivor. So I was just thinking how interesting it would be if we had graphic novels or these stories told through comics, because the generations that are being born now in Sri Lanka are essentially a generation of post-memory who have not lived through the war, but they're still inheriting memories from their parents and grandparents. So again, here, the pictures that I chose particularly were for the reason that they all incorporate photographs and comics. So some are real photographs that I reprinted, and some are just hand-drawn. So I was just really interested in how memory can be recorded in comics, really much for that. So that's just a snippet of my research, but I won't go too much into detail. So this was something that I did because I've sort of been wanting to do an autobiographical graphic novel of my own, but haven't really got started on it yet. But this particular comic was inspired by an activity that I did in Nepal at this workshop called Creating Heroines, which was organized by the British Council, and it was facilitated by Dr. Nicola. And So what she essentially told us was, she gave us a bunch of words, and she said, think of your earliest memory of this word, and just take a couple of minutes and tell it in a 4-panel comic. So this was the story that I came up with. I've redrawn this for another publication, but I'll take you through panel by panel. So the word I got was beauty, and I was initially reminded of my mom. So it goes, the most beautiful woman I have ever known is my mom. I have a framed photograph of her carrying me as a baby. It jumped into one, yeah. She didn't know she was beautiful because no one told her, not even her mom. So when she heard it when she was older, she never believed anyone. And she's thinking how beautiful these films are. And the third panel goes, when she married my father, the newspapers had published their photos, and everyone had told her that she was the most stunning bride they had ever seen. She never, in fact, wanted to get married. It was her childhood dream to take on robes as a Buddhist nun and meditate in a forest or the Himalayas. 2 years ago, she became ordained, head shaven, orange robed. She's still the most beautiful woman I know. So that was just something that just came out of this one activity that was initiated at a workshop. So I was thinking, if I really put my mind to it, I'm sure there's just a lot of treasures in there if I dig deep and start writing this graphic novel. The next thing I wanted to sort of talk about was where I draw inspiration from. So this is just starting from the everyday and mundane, like my work, and also just the things I see. I love going to museums, and I love reading books about art. So I just wanted to take you through just where my mind goes sometimes when I look for inspiration. Sort of obsession with Sri Lankan masks, and these masks are mainly worn for performances on stage. And this character, and what I did was I recreated these masks that I found. I did research on them, and I recreated them with plasticine and coconut coir, and it was just everyday sort of things that you can find at any old stationery shop. So this is called the Anabira Kolama, who is sort of a character, like a narrator's character, who comes with a drum and creates a rapport between the audience and the performers. This is a police kolama. So a kolama is essentially sort of like a comic play, a masked performance, and the police sergeant is identified by the number on his hat. And the third and fourth are a naga, or the snake mask, and also a lion mask made out of, again, coconut and plasticine. And these are just pictures of how I made it. It was just making blobs of various colors and putting them together. And I ended up making a calendar, so one mask for each month, and it was a calendar that I made and sold in 2019 as part of a personal project. And so this is another place. So the museum is another place that I love to go to for inspiration. And I saw these instruments, and particularly this conch that was just so intricate and beautiful. And I just imagined, like, I just instantly went to this sort of place where I wanted to tell a story of a group of animals. So what happens is, it's a jungle in Sri Lanka, and there are people who are trying to cut down the forest, and these people, the animals get together, and they sort of decide to create a jungle orchestra and make enough noise to sort of scare the people away. So these are some of the characters that were inspired by just seeing these instruments in the museum. So that's a peacock playing a drum, and the jungle fowl, who is the national bird of Sri Lanka, playing a smaller drum. Something else that I wanted to mention was the importance of art and education, and how I've found this sort of balance between the two. I've been lucky enough to work on projects where I can combine the two and tell stories and help people understand research and help people understand science a little better. So these are some illustrations that I did. I had to sit through a conference organized by this organization called CPR South, which is Communication Policy Research South. So it's an organization that focuses on the global South and helps researchers to take their research up to policy level and actually make real life change. So while the organization does this, I think through art, we were able to help bridge that gap a little more. So what's happening in the first picture is somebody planting a seed and inspiring younger generations with all those ideas. And in the second one, it's just sort of the irony of academics that you would have conferences and publish in journals and have all these presentations, but you don't really solve the problem. So that's what they're trying to do by taking these publications up to policy level and help people. So I was part of the group that did the illustrations for this organization. This is another really fun project that I worked on with one of my friends, Lucas, who was studying these mangrove areas in the coastal areas in Sri Lanka. And again, he's a scientist, and he wanted to work together with an artist to sort of tell these stories about the mangroves and their importance to the private sector, basically, who are polluting the environment. And the title of his study was Using Arts-Based Research Methods to Engage the Private Sector in Mangrove Conservation and Restoration. So mangroves are essentially these trees that grow in coastal areas, and they have these giant roots that kind of hold the earth together. So they help to protect the earth from a tsunami or from bad weather and just basic erosion of the beaches. So it was just really fun to work with him and learn his research and then sort of interpret it through my sketches. Another really amazing project that I've been working on over the last year is with this group called Let's Build Great Things. And so they are a group of designers and architects, and they've been working with a low-income urban community. And they've been working with children from this community and showing them that you don't really need all that much to build amazing things. So what this group has done is they've made a manual of lesson materials and lesson plans so that this model can be copied in other low-income areas in Sri Lanka to help kids express themselves through art. So they're largely design and architecture based. So the first lesson in the book is called The Scale of Things, and it helps children to sort of understand their size in relation to other things. So made the lessons very localized to many local art books for children here. So I think this is a really special project. So in the first one, you'll find a jackfruit tree and the tiled roofs and the tuk-tuks, which are very commonly seen in Sri Lanka. And then I've gone on to show the whales and a dinosaur just to help kids sort of think out of the box. This is another lesson that's quite popular with the kids. It's called Paper Kings and Queens, and all you need is newspaper and some colored markers and glue and scissors, and they just go to town with it. So once a year they have their exhibition, and they love dressing up and then and being almost the guards at the exhibition in front. So this is, as I mentioned right at the start, something that I constantly struggled with, finding my voice, how I would define myself, how I would introduce myself. And I think over the years with my research in comics and with just all the reading I've done, I've realized that I don't know, I've been able to sort of share all my ideas in possibly through animation. And that has been like a key change that I've discovered, and really helped me with telling the stories that I wanted to tell in a sort of clearer way. So the first animation that I did was just very, very experimental. I did it with my husband and a mutual friend of ours. So like I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to incorporate history. And so this film was quite dark, and it embodied this event in history in 1983 in Sri Lanka called the Black July riots. And this was an event where Sinhalese people had sort of accosted and killed and burned shops of Tamil people. And something that was very symbolic in this time was this word bucket or baldia. And the word baldia here was important because in the Tamil language, the word baldia couldn't be pronounced. So it was often pronounced as paldia. So a Sinhalese person would stop a Tamil person on the road or in a bus and force them to pronounce this word. And once they identified them as Tamil, they would beat them or kill. It was just a really violent period, and it's said to be the catalyst almost of the 30-year-long civil war in Sri Lanka. So we wanted to tell the story, and it was all silent, the movie, except for the word baldia that you could hear. So this man wakes up from a nightmare almost, and he where he goes back into his memory. So it's sort of a fictional account, but we still wanted to tell this story. And again, what was interesting was that this history is not taught to us in schools. So it's just through art and through self-learning that I've come across all these stories, and I wanted to share it. And so just also a little bit of how we made the film. Yeah, so this is my husband Sumedha and his friend, and our mutual friend Sumudu. We didn't have a big budget. We almost used a zero budget for this story, and we used my phone to film it. And so they're both architects, and they were really good at making the building parts of the film, and I did the characters. And it ended up winning a film here winning an award here at a film festival in Colombo, and it was also screened at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Sri Lanka, which is really an amazing platform to share this story. So these are some clips. I don't know if I have too much time, but some very silent clips from the film. This is before, when he wakes up in the night from his nightmare. And he goes digging. We can go to the middle. So it's just paper and a cardboard at the back that we stained with coffee, and it wasn't too much. It was just very, very basic resources that we used for this. This is him going back in time. So we had a clock with the months written in all 3 languages in Sri Lanka. And it goes back to 1983. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, since I've tried paper animation, I kind of pushed myself a little more, and I've kept experimenting with animation, and it's just sort of revealed really interesting, really fun things. So I also wanted to maybe talk about how important collaborating and meeting other artists has been, including this event today. So last year in February, I attended this workshop that was facilitated by Nicola, and it was called Creating Heroines and organized by British Council, and there were 12 artists from South Asia and the UK. So these are just some of the doodles that I've done while eavesdropping on other people's conversations while I was there. So on the left, I have Sophia. She says, I studied Arabic for my BA, not because there are jobs if you know Arabic. I was trying to earn brownie points with God. And you have Tara and Nush, 2 other friends that I met there. And Tara is Nepalese UK, and Nush is Sri Lankan UK. And Tara asks, are there a lot of Sri Lankan people where you're from in the UK? And she replied, I don't know, I'll have to sniff them out. Be like, here, Sri Lankans, have some kotha roti. And if you know Sri Lankans, you know, they love their kotha roti and their curry. So yeah, this was an amazing opportunity for me to meet other artists. And afterwards, we were given a grant to sort of carry on and continue the work that we learned at Creating Heroines about who real life heroines are and about women from South Asia. And so what I did was a project called Animator, and I decided I wanted to interview a group of people from Sri Lanka and tell their stories through clay animation. So there were 6 women that I chose. There was Asha Devasya, who's a marine biologist, and then there was Lakmini Vijayasundara, who is in IT and a CEO, and she started up an amazing business for herself. And there was Amila Dinel, an architect who is also an archivist, and she's torn apart precious buildings and then that are going to be destroyed and then taken them and rebuilt them in other places. So it's been amazing telling their stories. So on the left is when we interviewed Asha, and on the right was her clay little avatar. Something that was really special was that I got to interview Sibyl Vettasinghe, who is a children's author and illustrator in Sri Lanka, and she's my personal heroine. And she was 91 years old when we interviewed her last year. And we were so lucky to be able to complete her animation and show it to her, because during lockdown, she sadly passed away. But just before that, she'd seen the animation, and she had emailed saying she loved it, and that was probably the best gift that we could have given to someone who is inspired. I think I think all the children of Sri Lanka have read her books, and it was amazing to give this back to her. This is Amila again. So her house on the right, which was amazing to see because she's used all these old tea factory windows, and her house is also a dining room and a living room and a garage and all in one. And it was amazing to be able to build her set and tell her story. These are some of the storyboards that I did before we actually built the little sets and props. So it was different. It was a completely new experience for me doing the storyboards because it's different from a children's book because things have to move. So it's essentially a sketch of the elements that have to move when you're drawing an animation storyboard. So this is all self-learned and self-taught, and it was a really great experience. So this is from Sibyl's story, where she talks about growing up in the village with her grandmother and watching the sunrise sitting by the river. And so we're making the 4th film at the moment, which is on Taji Dias, who is a traditional dancer in Sri Lanka. And her granddad brought this dance form from its ritual settings in the villages to performance on stage. And Taji is now the 3rd generation, and it's a group of women who are preserving this dance form. So it was just really special for us to tell her story. Just a few pictures from us making the film. I think this is last week. And a little clip from her film. I have a feeling I'm running out of time, Nicola. Can you? Right. So what was amazing was for this film, because the music is so particular, the traditional music, I was able to collaborate with Natasha Natarajan, who is a composer here, and also work with Devashri, who is a singer, and Daham, who has studied drumming at the University of Visual and Performing Arts here. So it was just amazing to collaborate with so many creative minds to bring this film to life. And we still haven't completed it, but hopefully I'll be able to share it in the coming weeks. And just before we went into lockdown in March, I managed to exhibit and screen the first 3 films. So we showed the props and sets, and also just pictures of how we made the films. So it was just really interesting to see people. And everyone just wanted to see how it was made, because animation is kind of magical that way. You just don't realize that stop motion is made out of thousands of photographs. It was amazing to share the process and also to share the films. And we also showed the original clips from the original interviews. So it was just nice to see that transition between the real and how we retold it through animation. So that's Amila Demel, the architect on the right, who is taking a photo of her puppet self in the pickup. This is the team that I've been working with. And we also just showed all these pictures of the process of how we made the puppets, and it was just all trial and error and figuring out a lot of things. This is us filming. So it's not a professional studio at all. This is a bedroom in our house. Again, trial lip sync scene where we made all these different mouths. We used phone torches, and I also, because of the grant, I was able to hire a cinematographer, Yoshita, who was amazing, and she had a camera and professional lights as well. So this is sort of a funny, the picture in the middle, because we didn't really have a tripod that could film downwards. So we tied it down onto a table with wire and had the camera pointing downwards. So we could film this scene for Asha Devas, the marine biologist. I think I'd probably share her film. Is there time for that, Nicola?
This is the first film that we did, which is based on marine biologist Asha Devas, and this is one of 6 animated interviews that we've done. Hope we can all hear it.
As a child, I would spend time under the blue whale skeleton in our National Museum. And it was strung up across the ceiling. It's 65 feet long. So for a child, I mean, not that I'm that much taller now, but for a child who's like pretty minuscule, you're lying under this and you're thinking, how does a creature this gigantic exist? Where does it exist? How does it eat? How big are its babies? When I was 18, I was resolute in the fact that I want to be a marine biologist. Everyone around me was like, but Puta, what are you going to do with this degree? And I was like, but this is an island. Why are we questioning it? But it just goes to show our priorities as a nation, despite being an island nation, weren't related to engaging with the ocean in a way that's recreational or in a manner of conservation. It's not an easy ride being a woman in science, being a woman from South Asia in science, because certainly for us as a woman, there's all kinds of challenges, everything from being dismissed to, I mean, I've been at meetings where I was too young and too female, so nobody wanted to listen to me, to people being very patronizing about, oh, have your parents given you permission to do this? Or does your husband mind? Nobody will ask men those same questions. I still go back to the museum. I still walk around this skeleton. I tell people to take their children because it's a place where dreams are made. And I think that's kind of remarkable.
So I'm Natasha Natarajan. What Irushi said about finding it hard to define yourself really resonated with me. And I've been practicing in my head what I'm going to say now. So here I go. I'm a freelance creative, and so I do a lot of graphic and web design for money. And I also work part-time with people with learning difficulties. But in the context of LD Comics, I am the author and maker behind FML Comics, which is an autobiographical comic strip about myself. And I've been writing it since about 2015. And I just write it as and when life happens to me. So yeah, it covers my life, things that occur to me, things that resonate with me in day-to-day life. And here are some snapshots of what it looks like. It was really entertaining putting this together because all my different faces in one place. I'm like, wow, I look different. But yeah, I've been writing it since 2015. But in 2016, I started self-publishing it into A5 zines. So I have 4 issues so far. They're about 20 pages long, and that's what they look like on the left. And I'm really excited that in January 2021, Good Comics have decided to publish my comic strips into a collection. So all my comics so far, definitely that I've self-published, so everything that's in issues 1 to 4 is going to be in this collection with a spine, which is really exciting to me. And I'll tell you more about that later. But first, I just wanted to introduce you to my comics, I guess. So I'm going to read a couple out for you. This is one. Why Women Should Rule the World, on Holiday 2017. Guys, let's play a game where we say things that we like about each other. Here's another one. This poem reminds me of you. Check out this poem. It reminds me of you. Oh, Arnold, that's so sweet. The Ballad of the Lonely Masturbator, Anne Sexton. At night alone, I marry the bed. These are, by the way, like real people in my life. I get a lot of satisfaction from recreating my friends and family in cartoon form. And also just like my clothes, like these are real clothes that I wear. And this amazing jumper my friend actually wore. A lot of my early comics were about sort of cringe, embarrassing life moments, but also about dating. So there's a couple people that stand out in that section of my life. One of them is Living in the Moment Guy. So here's number 1 of Living in the Moment Guy. After a weekend of passionate romance, I'm sad that you're leaving. I don't even know when I'll see you again. Right. And how the fuck do I do that? Yeah, man, carpe diem. 1 month later, a 24-hour encounter. You're amazing, Natasha. I'm so interested in you. But like, not in a romantic way, if you know what I mean. Totally. Yeah, I'm living in the moment, man. What the? Be cool. A couple minutes later. But you never know with life. Fuck this moment. When are you going to fall in love with me? This is a more recent comic that I wrote during lockdown. I think my comics have developed quite a lot. And one thing that, like, especially thematically, they're not as funny anymore. But also I started narrating them at some point. So this is a little taste of that. There's a lot more narration in my comics now. This one's called The Bricks Are in Bloom. I've been missing the countryside a lot. Sometimes the feeling is all-consuming. I'm scared that I'm depressed again. But the other day I got high and happy and we went for a walk. We went to a park first, but I found it too tame and man-made, so we left and just roamed the streets. Why is everything so fucking neat? When in Rome, I guess. While walking, I realized how beautiful the bricks are in London. I couldn't stop staring. And then Ellie said the most perfect thing. It's like the bricks are so weird because they've been right in front of me this whole time. I can see them from my bedroom and balcony, but I hadn't properly noticed how lovely they look. I'm trying so hard now to see and acknowledge all the other beautiful things that must be right in front of me. Perhaps this period of self-isolation will help, but I find it so hard to see beauty in anything some days. It's okay. I know there is beauty around me. I'll find it soon. So yeah, I'm not going to read this one out, but I just wanted to show that, like you saw, they're usually like A5 portrait or landscape. Sometimes they're 2 pages, like the bricks are in bloom. Sometimes they're 3 pages. But yeah, they're mostly A5. And like I said, I just write them when life happens to me. So they cover pretty much everything that goes on in my life. Nothing really goes untouched. I never really plan what I'm going to talk about. It just sort of happens. And I basically take like micro moments or mini experiences that have happened and reflect on them and try to connect them to larger things, I guess, happening around us. Because I feel like life exists in this daily thing that we're all doing, but we're all sort of connected by cultural phenomenon and social things that are happening. And most importantly, I feel like we're connected by like emotional truths. And a lot of my comics are about some kind of shame or pain that I'm feeling. And it feels like that's universal to us all. Yeah, maybe it sounds a bit much, but the longer that I've written my comics, I've realized that even though they're so particular to my own experiences, that a lot of what I'm talking about actually resonates with more people. Because at the beginning, I was just making them for myself. I was literally just doodling on pieces of paper and sharing it with my best friends. But the more I started showing them to people, the more I realized that people really can relate to my very, very specific moments. That was a great feeling. So yeah. Oh, yeah, that was a great feeling. And at some point in 2018, I read The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing, and I came across this quote. And I think it really explains what I believe about my comics and about diary comics or autobiographical comics in general. I'm just going to read it out first. Writing about oneself, one is writing about others, since your problems, pains, pleasures, emotions, and your extraordinary and remarkable ideas can't be yours alone. The way to deal with the problem of subjectivity is to see the individual as a microcosm. After all, understanding one new and incredible experience is what everyone shares. And I find that to be really true, that like the deeper that I go into myself to find a comic, the more it seems to be a comic about everyone. And I actually know when I'm writing a good comic is when I'm really scared to share it, because it's something about something particularly painful, something particularly hard to share. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience also have that feeling about when you write. It's the hardest ones that you know are going to hit. Sometimes I'm also like, because because I write them when life happens, sometimes it's like once a month, once every 2 months, and sometimes it's once a week. And in those periods where it's once a month, I'm like, oh, fuck, I've got to write another comic. But that I feel like is not a good approach to it, because I know those comics aren't the good ones. The good ones are the ones that come out of a feeling of real, genuine emotion or something. But some of my favorite moments about making comics is being able to share them, not only because it's nice that someone wants to read them and someone resonates with it, but also for me that I'm sharing this really personal thing. It's such a relief to know that someone else feels the same way. And in my early days especially, actually still now, I always wrote my email address on my zines, and so that people could chat with me, because that was one of the main fun things about comics, was going to zine fairs and chatting with people that were reading them and all those kind of things. But I got this email at some point in the early days of making comics, and I'm just going to read it out to you because I think it's hilarious and also explains my point. I bought your issue 2 from Ladybus Collective in Edinburgh today. I picked it up and then couldn't stop nodding and laughing and saying yes under my breath, and figured it was probably a sign that I should definitely buy it. It's the first zine I've ever bought, and bloody hell, thank you so much. I feel like I just watched all the excellent, grim, hilarious, bleak interactions of my sexual life played out by someone else I've never met. I've had so many cringe moments, good Lord, so many. It's why I'm so grateful for things like your comic and Broad City and my other pals who have equally awful times, because sometimes I'll overhear a nice office girl be like, God, it was so embarrassing. I had this tiny bit of spinach stuck in my teeth for like 5 minutes and he never said. And I'll think, mate, I just went on a date with a guy who listed every mobile phone he'd ever had in chronological order, and I hadn't even asked. I think you got off lucky with the spinach tooth, frankly. I just found that the funniest story ever. I was so happy when she shared that with me. I've told like everyone I know. But it was definitely moments like those that kept me invested in making comics and interested in sharing them. And actually, like, friendships came out of conversations like these. And making comics about myself has been a way of communicating, maybe that I can't always communicate things about. Like, sometimes I'll make a comic about my parents, like something kind of not tragic, but real and painful about my relationship with my parents. And then I'll send it to them to be like, hey guys, so I made this. But it's not necessarily something that we've talked about before. So it's become like a good way of discussing things, that like a good starting point for discussions, I think. This is another more so somber one that I'll read out. Natasha, I woke up scared in the middle of the night after a strange dream. To get past the fears and the voices in my head, I opened my laptop and the first thing I saw was your drawing in Ernestine's profile. I stayed up the rest of the night reading your graphic stories. I felt embraced and understood. I will be thinking about you. So yeah, definitely one of the things that keeps me going with comics is like being able to talk and converse with the people who read them. I think that's a big thing. I thought I'd just spend the second part of the presentation talking about how I got to this place, because when I started drawing comics, I was just doodling on pieces of paper. I was studying to be like a web developer. I didn't really know that I wanted to be a creative, let alone make a career out of it. It was just kind of a hobby. And it's kind of magical to me that this whole community and this whole world exists, and that I found out you could self-publish zines, and yeah, that you could make comics and be in a Zoom call with 100 something people who are listening to you talk about them. So yeah, I'll just tell you a little bit about my journey. So the left picture you'll see here is the first comic I drew. It all came out of an obsession with a guy who was a sound engineer, and I used to do that a lot. I used to be like a fangirl about random people that were sort of acquaintances, and I got really drunk and shared an awkward moment with him, and couldn't get it out of my head, and told everyone I knew, so much so that it was driving me crazy, and I just started doodling about it. And so that's what you see on the left, and that's what eventually became my first comic. It was called Cool Sound Engineer Guy. And actually at the beginning I used to call them fandom series, because I called this obsession that I would have with people fandom. So this was fandom series number 1. But I continued. Oh yeah, this is what it looks like. Cool Sound Engineer Guy, first comic I made. It kind of looks like him, actually. I spend a lot more time making sure the people that I draw, the other people that I draw, look like those people, and very little time having any consistency of my own face. So that's kind of interesting, but it's fine, usually fine, because it turns out I spend a lot of time with white people, and so I'm usually the only brown character. So yeah, which is actually, I forgot to mention this story. Nicola, you thought it was interesting, so maybe I should share it. That at some point at the beginning of when I first started to publish my zines, I got an opportunity to print with risograph printers. And I don't know if you know about risograph technology, but it's like you print in 3 layers and you can only use 3 colors. But basically through the development process, I realized that I wouldn't easily be able to print myself in brown. And it was kind of a turning point for me, because I realized that I didn't want to print my comics if I couldn't be brown in them. And that was actually really important, that my comics would always be color and I'd always be brown. And so those are kind of, I guess, learning that you learn while you're doing these things. Like, I wouldn't want to print my comics in black and white. The only time that I have done that is for a comic anthology that was about people of color, and ironically it was called Full Color, and I was not brown. But anyway, yeah, it's important to me that I'm brown. So yeah, I started doodling more of my like internal thoughts, more situations that were distressing me, I guess. But also at the beginning, it was very much about finding punchlines and making funny comics. I had that personality anyway. I was always telling stories about, like, funny stories about myself and like cringe stories. And I think actually at the time it felt kind of new to be exploring this like tragic comedy genre, but I guess now there's a lot more media for that, especially like, you know, women having cringe moments stuff. I was missing that genre of like television and cartoons and stuff when I started making them in 2016. So that's what I was looking for. And eventually I had, I don't know, like 10, 15 comics, and I decided to make a website out of them, basically because I knew how. And I also knew how to make an email list, and I put all my comics on this website. I shared it with my two best friends, and it was just satisfying, I think. And it kind of gave me purpose to create them, just to have somewhere to put them. But I never intended really to do anything much with them. But I feel like I have that personality of like, I'm just going to do this kind of for the joy of it. But it meant that in my early days of making comics that I had quite a good infrastructure from the get-go to share it if I wanted to. So the main first thing that happened to me was finding out about zines. When I started making comics in 2015, I did not know what a zine was. I also lived in Copenhagen, where I feel like nobody really, it was kind of entertaining that I made comics, but nobody was really that interested. But in 2016 in March, I moved to Edinburgh and I started volunteering with this organization called Girls Rock School. And I suddenly came across this community who was really interested in indie comics, knew a lot about indie comics, and also knew about zine culture. So I learned a lot from them and from that time about zines and about indie comics. Like, people had huge collections of like graphic novels and anthologies of like dykes to watch out for and all this kind of stuff that I hadn't really known was a world really till then. And so that really blew my mind. But also Girls Rock School invited me, should we say, to sell my zines at their merch table at a gig. So that was the first time I printed FML comics. I like frantically went to my print and copy shop. I did not know that you could print short run at the time. I don't know if you could. It was 2016. Probably you could. But I went to my print and copy shop. Like, I paginated all the A4 pages myself, and then I stapled them. I probably made about 15 or 20 and took it to this like gig in a pub, put it on a merch table, which had no other comics with it. But it was a kind of community, I guess, that was really interested in this kind of DIY comics culture and zines. And it was just thrilling. I didn't know that you could do that in life. So it was a really fun time. And I started selling them online because, again, I knew how to do that. And yeah, that's how the first zines came about, or the first like booklets of my comics. But the main thing was like finding out about zines, because once you know the word zine, I could find all these opportunities to go to zine fairs, basically. I mean, zine fairs totally changed everything. It was like a really direct way of selling your stuff. And I still remember the first zine fair I went to. It was in a pub called Paradise Palms in Edinburgh. And I remember who I sat next to. You know, it was like you splayed out. It felt, actually, when I go to zine fairs now, I feel like they're a lot bigger than they were don't know if that's true or not. Maybe it was just this particular one, but I had like a small round table and just displayed my zine in front of me, and people like passed and read them. I mean, probably most of you have been to a zine fair, so I don't need to explain it, but it was really thrilling for me because I love the spirit of zine fairs, and like all the, you know, having all these ideas and small booklets, and they were very affordable, and then all the people like chatting to each other and zine swaps, and just the spirit of the whole thing is so nice. I totally loved it. And I'd moved to Edinburgh not knowing anyone. It was kind of a way to have community, and it made my comics like a really fun hobby. It was, yeah. So yeah, zines changed my life, is the summary of this section. And through zines, I realized that there are places which will stock zines. I mean, actually the pub that hosted the the first zine fair, one of the waitress who's really into zines and organizes everything, she had a small shop called Chris Shop in like the corner of the pub where she would sell the zines. So the bottom right picture is the first place I ever sold my zines. I think she actually messed up my name, but that's okay. And then I kind of, from there, just had the audacity to go and ask places if they'd sell my zines. And it kind of just grew from that on the way. And also zine people taught me how to do things, and talking to zine people, yeah, you just learn a lot by doing, I guess. Just like Irushi said, you learn on the job, don't you? And the longer you do it, the more you find out. But yeah, so there was zines and the zine community. I feel like that was the first community and network I had. And then I still don't know how Mary Naomi, who's pictured here, how she found out about me. But she, at some point in 2016, she started something called the Cartoonists of Color database. I think she also has the disabled cartoonist database and queer cartoonist database now. But she added me to this Cartoons of Color database and shared some of my work, which was really exciting to me because it was all very small scale. I mean, you know, at a zine fair, I'd probably sell 3 zines, swap a few. Yeah, you know, it wasn't a big enterprise at all at the time. Still isn't actually, but you know, so it was a big deal to be recognized by someone in America, and I didn't know how she'd found out about me. But my favorite moment about all of this is that, so Almond Flower Brownies guy is one of the characters in my cartoon, and his friend from India had like come across this Facebook post and emailed him to say, "Hi, you absolute doofus, are you Almond Flower Brownies guy?" Which obviously was a great moment because, you know, A, someone in India had found my comics, but B, also had recognized the character. Because, like I said, I pay a lot of attention into making the characters very similar to who they are. But also, he was an Almond Flower Brownies guy. Like, he was into that. I think that's like his defining feature. Anyway. But yeah, so networks been really important to me. So I don't know how Cartoonists of Color database Mary Naomi found me, but having me on that database meant that BHP Comics, which is a Scottish publisher, they found me through that database because they were doing a project for young people, young cartoonists of colour, and they were making this anthology in Scotland, and the project leader, she found me through the database and invited me to participate. So yeah, it's all these like really small things that came together to take me places. But it was a really cool opportunity because I got passes to go to some conferences, and I got to speak at Glasgow Comic-Con on diversity and meet new people. And also, actually, this was the first time I started narrating my panels. I had never done that before. So yeah, and it made me feel like a cartoonist, like being published by a cartoon publisher and whatnot. It gave me a bit of oomph to keep going, I guess. And so yeah, that's probably what drove me to then apply to be a panelist at this conference, Queers and Comics. I kind of did it just on a whim. I don't know if anyone does this when they're like bored and like looking on the internet, like comics opportunities, Google. But I came across this, I applied for it, I never thought I would get it, but so I went to this conference in New York and I spoke, and again, I feel like half of the fun, if not half, like 60 or 70% of the fun of comics is meeting all the other comics people and chatting and like making these networks, and also getting to discuss what you're trying to say, I guess. I mean, I feel like the people who've been most receptive to my work are other artists and other comics people. So meeting them at conferences or things like this as well has been the most rewarding aspect. But Queers and Comics pretty much directly leads me to LDC because that's where I met, I think, the only other British panelist at the conference, Rachel House, and I kind of kept in touch with her, and then she invited me to speak in January at LDC, at an LDC event like this for queer cartoonists. And so that's how I found out about this community. And yeah, I don't know why putting this together was one of those moments where I realized like all the small micro things that happened to make your life change. And it always reminds me that not to underestimate what something really small can do to your life or to your career. And to always like take those small opportunities and just keep like climbing the little threads and seeing what happens. But yeah, in terms of the book, that also kind of connects me to LDC again as well, because I always wanted to put my comics into a book. I'm really particular that I want to have a book with a spine, so I really wanted a book. I knew that I wanted to publish all the comics together, and so in March I started putting it together. I was determined. I think I would have self-published it if I hadn't found a publisher, but so I started putting it together in March, and I like printed them all onto A6 pieces of paper and put it up on my wall to try and figure out like where everything should go and if I could put them together in some kind of thematic way. LD Comics having their festival and their mentoring sessions, so it was kind of all came together really perfectly because I had some mentoring sessions, and then I went to the festival, the online Facebook watch party thing, and found out about some different publishers, and that's where Good Comics came to present, and that's how I found out about Good Comics. So when they were when they opened their submissions, I was kind of ready with the, fairly developed book and concept. And that's what kind of brings me here today, because what you see in the corner is FML Comics Collected, 2016 to 2020. Pretty much all the comics I've made, kind of. It's definitely issues 1 to 4, plus what would have been 20 more comics, and some written chapters where I try to describe that behind the scenes of what was going in my life simultaneously. And they're running a Kickstarter at the moment. So please, if you like what you see, back the project. There's some other great cartoonists and comic artists in the project. I think they're publishing 3 other books and also a reader of the Good Comics anthology. So there's the link. And then I just put this slide, and I've been trying to figure out exactly what I want to say here. But I think my general feeling is I've been thinking a lot about what the role of an artist or creative is. And while I'm really grateful that I get to publish a comic book, I feel like my comics have been more a platform, or what excites me most about my comics is using them as a platform to talk about different themes and to really discuss stuff with people. So that's why I like zine fairs, because your readers are right in front of you. Often what happens is people open my comics, they start laughing, and I'm like, which one are you laughing at? Has that happened to you? Like, what's going on? So I feel like my comics are a good starting point for conversation. And I'm aware that, not everyone who I want to have that conversation with is someone who's going to buy my comic. And so I want to find ways of talking like using illustration to talk about things, but it doesn't have to be a comic book, you know. So yeah, I want to lend my skills to other people and other voices, and use my comics to talk more about the themes that I'm interested in, and also like just generally to inspire creativity in everyone, because I feel that comics have been a huge therapy to me. I started them just because I was feeling so angsty, and I never intended for anyone to read them, really, not at the beginning anyway. So I feel like the tools of creativity are useful to everyone in all types of life. I mean, the things I learned through my comics, I feel like I definitely implement in different areas of my life, like patience, for example, a really basic thing. But yeah, that's what I'm going to say about what next. So thanks. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, so just thanks for having me. Should I do a bio or something? I am Hannah Eaton. I always think I'm unemployed, but I'm not, because I write graphic novels. But I sort of worked with kids for 20 years and have stopped doing it because it was really exhausting. So now I just write graphic novels and do a bit of teaching, really, and that's it. And I found it quite hard to write something about Blackwood. My new book. This is the cover. It feels like I'm too close to it because it's taken me 7 years. It's like a child, and I realised as I wrote that it's the product of my last fertile years, where actually having a human child might have been possible, as well as the time I spent witnessing. I mean, this is starting absolutely doom laden, isn't it? Like witnessing the death of my granddad, who was lovely, who had Alzheimer's, who was like my last family elder, who's so much in its pages. So it feels like a massive sort of birth and a death, like a huge 10-pound book baby that I've squeezed out of my creative fat of a cow stomach. So anyway, I said to Nicola, I'll probably just do something about folklore and Brexit, and that's it. Yeah, I'll start there. Thus, having talked about myself. But those two presentations were so amazing, and I feel guilty for sort of being a bit of an evader and talking about sort of sources and stuff, but I hope you enjoy it anyway. The Blackwood and Naming Monsters, which was my first book. I can't get the hang on, I can't get the PowerPoint to move. Wait a minute. Yes, I can. That's fine. So Naming Monsters, my first book, are both concerned with stories of folklore and of hauntings which may or may not be real, of the symbolic or psychological meanings of these tales of what Philip Pullman calls, in quite a beautiful phrase, the secret commonwealth, the beings that dwell in the personal and collective imagination. In Naming Monsters, the main character, Fran, tells herself stories about monsters and bogies to try and deal with her feelings around the death of her mum. And in Blackwood, a town is enthralled to a slightly off-kilter way of life based around so-called old traditions, which are really the invention, more or less, of a powerful local family. I'll read a couple of excerpts about this one. This is the detective in the 50s kind of doing a house-to-house about a murder. Thank you, Miss Interesting Necklace. It's a mole's foot for the rheumatics. He knocks on the door of the manor house. Hello, mate. I don't know why I'm suddenly giving them a Brummie accent. Police. Master is in the long room. Good afternoon. How do you like my chambre de merveille, Detective Constable? Sorry. Dunstable? Very interesting, sir. No, charmingly vaudevillian. How may I be of service? That Mr. Daniel Riley, sir. I believe he's once worked for you. I have the most important collection of magical and ritual objects in all England, and so many are a part of this town's moral and spiritual fabric. This mask is the famous Dorset Oozer, believed by so many to have been lost. Now a much-loved guest at my children's day. I don't need to read the rest of that. So Blackwood is a sort of murder mystery, and I love murder mysteries. And I even liked as a child the way that Agatha Christie would use like a kind of obfuscating woo-woo. She'd use scary old myths and seances, talismans and rituals as red herrings or veiling devices. I can remember this one that my mum had, which had a picture of a sort of granite statue of Anubis on the cover, and I was obsessed with it. And she sort of used these red herrings to lead us away from the truth of the matter, that human beings can be really bad to each other. And that concept has really inspired me. I think it's inspired Blackwood. And I think that there is a parallel between the narrative of about folklore I give in Blackwood and the co-opting of history for the purposes of toxic or politicised nostalgia that we're so expert at in this country. Long before the Brexit vote, I think it's about 2010, when the Conservative coalition took over, there was suddenly this little current in popular culture which seemed to replace the narrative of pluralism and multiculturalism, which had been there for the previous 20 years or so, which felt like and feels like the place where I live and where I grew up. And it was little things I kept noticing, a visual language of like bunting and Rosie the Riveter scarves and sort of 1930s Oswald Mosley haircuts for the men and folksy music on adverts. And when you felt all nice and cosy at the village fete, they'd hit you with the notion of Great British so-and-so. I totally absolve the Bake Off from this judgment because it's amazing. But there'd be like a little Union Jack somewhere, and he hadn't seen Union Jack since the 80s when the NF used to sort of walk around with them, and it was really weird. And from then, it felt like it was a really short step to things like detaining immigrants and manipulating people through the tabloid press to believe that they're disenfranchised because of other poor people rather than the wishes of billionaires. One of the thoughts I had about Blackwood as I was writing it back in about 2014, and it was still just about a dystopian fiction rather than a gritty real life drama, was about trying to portray the sort of fascism that could arise out of Britain. And then I ended up with a kind of extremist village NIMBYism. There was some talk around that time about like devolution of power to local government, and literally all you would have to do, I found out after a bit of research, was a little bit of localised privatisation, like of the security services and stuff like that, and a tweak to habeas corpus, and you could end up with stateless citizens and detention camps, and everyone claiming to be none the wiser because we keep ourselves to ourselves. So scapegoating, mistrust of your neighbours, and NIMBYism, half-belief, they're all things which, if you have the means to create your own syncretic folklore cult, which, oh my God, I wish, fit nicely into magical tradition, like, you know, sort of the social uses of witchcraft, for instance, things like that. And the Clevedons, which is the kind of ruling family in Blackwood, who start off as lords of the manor in the early 20th century, and then become the kind of owners of the housing association, the kind of the privatized sort of public services, the corporation. They, like Lord Summerall in the Wicker Man, sorry, that for people, I know some friends of mine don't watch horror films, that is Lord Summerall in the Wicker Man. Before them, they create a patchwork ideology from fragments of oral superstition and local occult beliefs, with a dollop of blood and soil Nazi pomp to maintain social control and economic supremacy. And this is Councillor Colin Clevedon and the town elders, which is what I call this kind of committee at one of their special council meetings. Oh, yeah, sorry, probably needs one. Sorry, that's such a boomer joke. I'm such a dick. Anyway, I think it's like, you probably need one of those because, I don't know, like old naked fascist wizards or something. I hope no one's actual pot of trauma contains old naked fascist wizards, but here we go anyway. I will read his weird ritual out. So if this was live, I'd get you all to chant the Latin in the background for a bit of atmosphere, but I can't. So they're all saying Opidum est in silva canis, which means something like the town is in the wood of the dog. Opidum est in silva canis. With father's sword I cast this circle, in the season of the hunting, in the dying of the Blackwood. Come, great elders Blackwood, Albion's hazel, Albion's oak and Albion's hazel, deep thy roots and pure thy ground. May the dark man from the Southland leave no footprints in my homestead. May the sounds of sons of town and farmland live to prosper like thy fathers. Blood and soil, blood and soil. This is a bit obvious when you're on. Mingle here and purify us. blood and soil in the time of our domain. Et sanguis venis est in terra. That means the true blood is in the earth. Sanguis venis est in terra, sanguis venis est in terra. Keith. Blah, 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 blah. Sanguis venis est in terra. With father's sword I break this circle. May we have no trespass. That felt like a good one. Yes, most satisfactory. Yeah, really felt the power from the old oak. I was thinking next time we might try a cone of power. Ah, Gerald Gardner, yes, Battle of Britain, repelling the invading hordes. I like it. Hang on, didn't some of them die? Oh, well, they were in their 90s. It was February, bloody brass monkeys. They used a cone on the Spanish Armada. Napoleon, in Arthur's time, I don't doubt. Yeah, should work on a few refugees and jippos. Ah, did you know number 10's got a ley line running right through it? St. Paul's down to Canterbury. And government are missing a trick, eh? Oh, Cleveland Manor's got at least 3, I'd say. Hurry up, you two, and bury that thing. Hillary's getting kitchen sups ready for 9. So it's a bit unfair of me, really, on all the lovely magical practitioners who exist, to only highlight the use of magic by the ruling classes and the far right. But it's got a long history, and sorry, Steiner parents, but your kid's lovely creative school is a cult founded on some really filthy 19th century racist taxonomy. It is. Look it up. Also, does anyone? I wish I had a real audience because people would be putting their hands up or not. If anybody knows about meme magic, this is another horrible wormhole I've gone down. It's far right satire that believes in itself, like Trumpism and magical thinking and pseudo-Egyptian frog deities. And also, really pathetically, it is at base just a digital version of the 1950s school child craze for lucky bus tickets. It's something to do with the numbers on your 4chan posts and stuff, or something like that, that add up to 21 that the OPs talk about in the law and language of school children. Anyway, so, oh yeah, this is another quite interesting thing. Did you know about the Rose and Cross visualization? During World War I, there was this poster of the Rosy Cross, which is an old alchemical and magical symbol associated with the Freemasons and the Golden Dawn. I'm not quite sure what Rosicrucianism is, but it's that anyway. And it was in the tube stations in London. And while you were waiting for your train, you were supposed to visualize it suffused with white light over the channel. So you imagine the channeling, you imagine this figure above it, and genuinely the effort of people waiting for the tube was supposed to ward off a German invasion. And the made-up right that you've just seen, and Colin Clevedon alludes to it in the comic, is like a perversion of Gerald Gardner's attempt, and God only knows what that thing is. Sorry, in 1941, with his coven of witches in the New Forest, to raise a magical cone of power, which is like a kind of another sort of light emanation or something, in order to do the same during the Battle of Britain. Not ward off another German invasion. So creating Blackwood was really just a slight exaggeration of reality, really. And this is some of the stuff I read for research that was very highbrow, as you can see from the Ladybird Book of Special Days and Customs, which is quite useful actually. And this one here, I don't know if you can do pointers on this. That one there, that yellow book with the handcuffs on it. That is Robert Fabian, who was like the first celebrity detective. It was his memoir about his detective career at Scotland Yard, where he talks about the Meehan Hill pitchfork murder of 1945, which 2 of the murders in Blackwood are based on. And this is like a real life slice of folk horror. This elderly farm labourer called Charles Walton was bludgeoned to death and then stuck and marked with his own pitchfork and billhook, which was supposed to be a local practice. This was in rural, like Warwickshire, Oxfordshire border, to stop a witch from walking after their death. And any attempt, it was the Wicker Man. Any attempts from his team to investigate were thwarted by like button-lipped locals and accounts of witchcraft and a xenophobic scapegoating of an Italian prisoner of war who everybody said did it for a while and had nothing to do with it, and rampant superstition. And Fabian reported that the day after having heard a story about the victim, Charles Walton, encountering a ghostly black dog 9 times, which was like obviously a death omen, he says, A police car ran over a dog. Next day, a heifer died in a ditch. And when Albert Webb and I walked into the village pub that evening, silence fell like a physical blow. Cottage doors were shut in our faces, and even the most innocent witnesses seemed unable to meet our eyes. Some became ill after we spoke to them, in some weird mass hysteria or something. My auntie used to live down the road from there, from me and Hill, in the 90s. And it was still very much a thing people whispered about. And they talk about me and Hill in a sort of 16th century way. Apparently it's where the witches hold their sabbats. And it is quite a creepy place. It's an Iron Age hill fort near a famously haunted stone circle. For some reason, the summit is nearly accessible. It's like I can see you, Patrice. It's near Chanctonbury. It's like Chanctonbury Ring. It's that kind of copse on top of a flat hill, like in Sussex, where near where we live. Yeah, there's no footpaths or bridleways going up at all to it. And I used to ask her about it. And I was sort of desperate for the truth of it, for this story to be magical and supernatural rather than just brutal and sad. And it's the Agatha Christie thing again. And this is my detective Dunstable saying, see, all this stuff, the spooks and magic, whether it's true or not, it's irrelevant to me, Maggie. This is about the evil men do to each other, no more, no less. And yeah, no, I agree with him. But Britain is thick with ghosts and believers, and everyone's got a ghost story. Like almost everyone I ask ever has got a ghost story. Hannah Berry's got an amazing one if she would like to tell anybody at any point. The way they always start with, like, my cousin Barry, right? Yeah, he's a total skeptic. He's the most down-to-earth bloke you've ever met. And then Barry ends up, like, turns out sharing an office. He's sharing an office with a Roundhead soldier, or like gets chased by a shape-shifting demon donkey on his way back from the pub. And often the ghost stories will have like subtle undercurrents that echo the person's traumas or cultural preoccupations. I mean, folklore obviously has this function in a broader sense, like Haitian zombie lore, kind of echoing the sort of the dehumanized impotence and terror of the enslaved, or like all those endless sort of adolescent boy ghosts after 1914, like turning up at seances with flowers for their mums from France. And I think a lot of it, ghosts, I think a lot of it is people just trying to make sense of things under stress, like why people get ill and why they die and leave you. It'll be interesting to see whether the pandemic creates a new layer of the ghost craze, like kind of what stories we get to hear, what with a sort of with the supernatural filter on them. And I've lived on the south coast in Brighton for 20 years now, and in Kent before that, which is another story entirely. But there are mediums and spiritualists everywhere. I remember I had this boss once. That's not her. Well, it is her actually. The manager of a care home. She was like really clever and totally pragmatic, and the sort of woman that you could, would solve any problem that you threw at her to do with looking after people. Who like casually revealed to me in a meeting that she was like reincarnated Assyro-Babylonian temple priestess, and she was accompanied at all times by a white tiger in spirit. I was like, where is he now? And she said, he's under the table. He's helping me with your appraisal. And so I did pass my probation. So thanks, Simba, which he was rather unoriginally called. I think he must have thought he was a lion. So no, anyway. So onto sort of folk horror. And although I think Blackwood really is probably too real life to be folk horror. I don't know. Maybe it does kind of get into the genre. I do like to claim kinship with the genre as well as the murder mystery. I love folk horror. And a story within the folk horror canon, is it yeah, it's a canon, isn't it? And contains several standard conditions. The first is probably the presence of an outsider in a closed society with whom our sympathies usually lie. So this is in Blackwood. This is my 4 girls kind of going to a wedding and sort of getting a bit lost. I won't read the whole thing. Look, that's where Caitlin said, first left. Oh, thank God, somebody did a geography coursework. God, it's real nowhere country here, isn't it? Yeah, no reception. I'm having to map read like the Victorians or something. Oh my God, these place names are amazing. Oh, look, Hayley, your boyfriend's come out to say hi. All right, sexy. He's shouting something at us. Yeah, probably come join the family spit roast. What's that? Hey, rank. So they're kind of the outsiders in entering this place. And then there's the use of landscape, and this can be rural or urban, but it's always somewhere which is linked to some primeval source of power or horror, or a sort of genius. Is it called a genius Loki, a spirit of place, like the spirits of dark and lonely water in that horrible, amazing Donald Pleasant's public information film from the 70s, or like Arthur Macken's White People. And I've invented a Blackwood dog, which is like a kind of elemental death omen thing that sort of lurks about in the woods, which is the only real bit of supernatural anything in the book, or it might not exist or anything. And anyway, sorry, I'm blaring on. Then there's a kind of othering of the outsider or of the inhabitants of the place because of opposing moral values or difference, which leads to a crisis, which could be like a summoning, or a sacrifice, a disappearance. That's the devil rides out, by the way. There's an unspeakable act, like at the end of Kill List, or sometimes an escape. Actually, like there's a thank God there's an escape at the end of Get Out. I'm sorry if you came here to hear about comics, but I know loads more about this stuff. I don't know very much about comics, I'm afraid. And because folk horror mostly comes from British or at least sort of colonial Anglo culture, like Wake in Fright and Picnic at Hanging Rock, I reckon are both Australian folk horror, even though they're really different. And I Walk with Jack Turner's I Walk with a Zombie, I would say, is folk horror as well. Which is set in the Caribbean. The values of the other are quite often to do with sexual libertinism, because of course this is the other to your sort of 1970s English person. Speaking openly about feelings, or dancing without having to have 4 pints of lager first, and stuff like that. So here we are again at the Wicker Man. And the Society of Summerisle, which kind of basks in communal celebration and boozy pleasure and sex magic, and where everybody daily bursts into sort of rude song, is completely in opposition to Sergeant Howie, who's the police officer who investigates a disappearance he goes in. Complete opposition to his sort of tight-lipped Presbyterian morality. Summerisle, unlike the grim 1970s mainland, is fun, and Howie's resistance to fun is literally what gets him killed. He's only sacrificed because he's still a virgin on May Day, and he's been given plenty of encouragement by Britt Eklund to become otherwise. And I suppose for the purpose of this talk, it's really sad. He's like Brexit personified. He's a one-man austerity drive, and his borders and his pajamas are proudly closed to incomers. Like no one's getting in. And whereas I think Blackwood is a more straightforward stand-in, obviously, for Britain or sort of Middle England itself. It's easily manipulable, slight fear and disgust of outsiders who then become easily dehumanised. It's a place obsessed with the legend of itself, which is and sort of keeps its own nasty secrets. There's another alternative ending in folk horror, which I think is really, really interesting, which has appeared in several narratives, including The Witch, the 2015 film The Witch, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Midsummer, and Clive Barker's amazing story In the Hills, the Cities, which I think is, that's it there, which is a story about a couple who go on a road trip to some unnamed Balkans sort of area, and these two warring city-states have a ritualized sort of decade-ly battle where the entire city kind of forms into this colossus and marches to, it's mental. Anyway, this is the comic of it, and the ending that happens in these films or stories is really different. It's a kind of ecstatic joining, like a remaining and a transformation of the incomer or the outsider through a sort of emotional migration, and the subsuming of their morality into the values of the other place and its culture. And when I saw, oh, where's me? That's not working. Oh, so it is. When I saw Midsummer and The Witch, like, I was this guy. I was totally this like chuckling pervert in the cinema. I was really like laughing with joy all the way through the final scenes, like Thomasine when she shoots into the air with the other witches, and Florence Pugh gets her revenge on her sort of douchey boyfriend. And it was so exciting to see a woman in this position at the end of a horror film, like the last girl saying yes to fun after so much trauma. And it's like, it reminds me of the end of Pink Flamingos as well, where like they go on a lam after Divine's killed everybody, and Mary Vivian Pearce goes, she says, oh, I'll have a crew cut, you'll have a pink DA, oh, in Boise, Idaho. And it's like, it's a real like John Waters morality, that sort of wrongness and joy winning out at the end of a really, really traumatic narrative. And then I'm imagining something really horrible. I'm imagining a horrible Brexit version of Midsummer now, where we join Nigel Farage in a wild all-night Morris dance where we all drink warm beer until we drop dead, and then the last one standing gets a commemorative plate with a Spitfire on it. But actually what I like about these endings is what I love about them is the generosity of the idea that when your family are traumatizing and dead, or when your country of birth is behind you, when your lovers are like predators or disappointing, or like your brother or something, there's another culture or another community that you can rush into the arms of who'll sweep you up. So sadly, because it's a book about England, the ending of Blackwood's a bit more subdued. I really thought about how to do the epilogue, because the drama's happened and you're kind of in a sort of uneasily peaceful place, and there's this sort of like, there's a trope in novels, I think, like sort of American literary novels, I don't know, where like at the very end somebody's like watching, I don't know, like a heron flying off a jetty or something, and it's supposed to be a statement about the transient of human sorrow. And I thought we've seen so much real banal human horror play out beforehand, and morality just seems to kind of be on the losing side. And I think I wanted to show with this very sort of nothingy ending that if you fully buy into denial, like if you switch off your wider empathy, then yeah, everything is really pretty at this time of year. And if you don't, then you have to sort of exist in a permanent state of disturbance. But I mean, at least you're alive. And I think the end of Naming Monsters is pretty similar. Yeah, end of Naming. Well, yeah, where Fran and her friend Alex are kind of in after the crisis. They're kind of in a street. She says, "Will you be all right?" And says, "Probably not. I'll see you tomorrow." And it's an awakening to reality, but a sort of possibility of, I don't know, truth and love, I suppose. And that's it. That's all I've got to say, really, I think.